What we do here matters, because what we don't do matters even more.
We need to continue to push, and we at ADAO are going to continue to push the Surgeon General of the United States.
As you know, the United States continues to use asbestos, and that indeed is a barrier to others stopping its use.
The most horrific part of this whole story is that it is preventable.
Well, thank you, Chairman, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I think I've figured out that this is the funny accent session that we're having. My name is Geoff Fary, and I'm the former chairman of the Australian Asbestos Management Review. And I've also figured out, looking at the timetable, that I'm all that stands between you and pre-dinner drinks. And that's probably a pretty dangerous place to be. So I'll try and keep this mercifully brief. At the outset, I'm delighted to receive the invitation to speak to this conference today. So thank you for that, Linda. And I'd also like to pay particular tribute to my colleagues on the Bernie Banton Foundation who are with us today. And without the support of that foundation, it wouldn't have been possible for me to be here. What I would like to do in a few minutes, and I will try and make it a few minutes, is to talk about some recent developments in Australia and possibly also to finish up my comments on a positive and hopeful note. And with any sort of luck, this machine will work. Part of the background of this is that Australia has the dubious reputation of being the largest per capita user of asbestos in the world. And consequently, we have one of the highest per capita rates of asbestos disease and death in the world. You've been presented with these sorts of figures in one form or another previously and throughout today, so I won't belabour them. Let me just point to one of those figures there, that it is projected that by the year 2020, some 40,000 of my fellow Australians will have succumbed to mesothelioma. Can I just put that in perspective for you? In terms of the relativities, I mean, we have a relatively small population. There are only 23 million Australians. The comparative figure for the United States would be to the order of 560,000. That is more, I am told, than all of the Americans who died in both the First and Second World Wars combined. So this is not a Mickey Mouse issue. This is a very, very serious issue that we all have to deal with. And the advice that was given to me is that the diagnoses in Australia, far from coming down, are in fact increasing. And the graph which is on the screen at the moment demonstrates that. It shows that the diagnoses of mesothelioma in particular, and there's obviously multiplication factors when you talk about other asbestos-related diseases, continues to rise, and the percentage of victims who are women continues to rise. That phenomenon in Australia we describe as being the third wave. That is, people who were previously presenting with asbestos-related diseases were people who worked in the processing and mining of asbestos or using it in the building and construction industry. What we are now finding, and this has been supported by a study by the University of Western Australia, is that there are increasing numbers of people presenting who have had no known employment exposure to asbestos, and this is being attributed to their exposure to it by way of do-it-yourself home renovations and the like, or do-it-yourself home renovations by their partners and their families. Australia has reacted to this by progressively introducing a number of bans and limitations over the years. We first introduced bans and limitations. On this slide I describe it as blue and grey asbestos. You obviously know it as chrysidolite and amosite. As far back as 1982, we mined the mining and processing of it, and then by 1987 we'd banned the use of all forms of asbestos in the building and construction industries in Australia, and by the year 2003 had introduced a total ban on the import and the export of asbestos and asbestos-containing products to Australia. You have obviously been given very dramatic evidence earlier on today that notwithstanding that ban, there is evidence of some of it slipping through, not the least of which some of it is slipping through from the United States of America, where products can be certified as being asbestos-free when they contain less than 1% by weight of asbestos. The literal interpretation of the Australian law is asbestos-free means total, complete asbestos-free. All of that led to the Australian government to appoint me to chair a committee of review a couple of years ago on how we should go about managing the problem of residual in situ asbestos in Australia, and it wasn't just limited to occupational exposure to asbestos. The slide which is before you is the terms of reference that I was provided, and you can see that it was very, very broad indeed. About the only things that I was not asked to look at is, number one, I was not asked to address the issue of compensation for victims of asbestos, because the view was that there were fairly established formula in place to do that. And secondly, I was not asked to address the issue of medical research, but if you ever get the chance to read the report, you'll see myself and my advisory group managed to push the envelope a little bit on that one anyway, and did finally address it. I was assisted by a specialist advisory group in the task. I won't go through and identify who all of them were, but suffice it to say they came from various areas of industry and the medical profession and other experts. What were the key drivers for the review? And again, I'll be brief with this, but basically from the outset we said we needed a visionary approach. The last thing that we wanted to do was to produce yet another voluminous report that would be destined to gather dust on departmental shelves in our capital city of Canberra. We wanted something which would be acted upon. What I found, and I think it's resonated through this conference, and it particularly resonated through the session that we've just had, the entire process was underpinned by the extraordinary dignity and goodwill and assistance that I was provided by those people who themselves were suffering from an asbestos-related disease. At many stages during the course of this review, they went to extraordinary efforts to put their views in front of me. Sadly, a number of them, and we knew it at the time, were not with us to see the review finalised. They were doing that not out of bitterness, but out of a genuine hope that something would come out of it that would mean that other people would not be subjected to what they'd been subjected to. Basic facts which we kept in mind throughout the review, and it's worth repeating, I think, to any audience, and it's been restated today, so again, I won't belabour it, nor will I belabour the process of preparing a discussion paper, the going through consultations, the calling for and the analysis of submissions that went on throughout the process. But let me summarise at the end of it by saying that in Australia, what were some of the things that folk agreed upon and what were some of the things that they didn't agree upon? And I was surprised, probably pleasantly surprised, to find that there were more things that people across the board agreed upon about the management of asbestos and what to do with it than what they disagreed on. I won't go into the sub-points that I've got there. The material is available on the website if you want to Google it. But there was agreement on the need for there to be more and better effort into the area of raising public awareness and educating people about the dangers posed by coming into contact with in situ asbestos. There was agreement that we needed to do something about the awful fragmentation we have in our country about the regulation of the removal, handling and safe disposal of asbestos. There was agreement that we needed to get better at the area of reporting and data, and we needed to use that data better for analysis and planning for the future. Again, there was agreement that we needed to be better about policing and implementing our import and export controls, and I've dealt with earlier on the issue of mislabelling. And there was agreement that we needed better across the board coordination of regulation of asbestos in Australia. It is a fact currently in Australia, prior to the implementations of the recommendations of my report, that if you happen to find that your neighbour is demolishing their home and you fear that it contains asbestos-containing products, the advice that you get will not only depend upon what state you live in, it will actually depend upon what municipality you live in. And there was agreement across the board that that really is a nonsense and that we need a uniform national approach. Not surprisingly, there were a couple of areas of disagreement. And those disagreements really revolved around the two issues that I've highlighted there. That is, should we, on the one hand, be aiming for the ultimate total removal of all asbestos from the built environment in Australia? Or should we be managing it in situ and taking a risk management approach? In other words, remove what's dangerous and friable and carefully monitor what's not. There was also mixed opinions around the do-it-yourself area. And that was, should we be providing people who are going to undertake do-it-yourself asbestos removal with information, training and possibly kits to enable them to do it safely? Or should we say that the process itself is so inherently dangerous it should only be undertaken by licensed, competent professionals? And that was another of the key areas of disagreement. When it came to preparing the report, after having analysed all of the input and listened to all of the arguments and the advice that I was given, myself and the advisory group agreed that those 5 points were fundamental to what we hope would be a successful report. That is, that we needed to aim high. However long it took, we took the view, and this is reflected in what we recommended to be the overarching objective of the Australian National Strategic Plan, that it is a man-made disease, it is an avoidable disease, and we should be accepting nothing short at the end of the day than a society which is totally free of asbestos-related disease. That this was an area where there was national leadership by our federal government required. It wasn't good enough to sit back and passively coordinate efforts by a whole range of other agencies, but the federal government itself needed to go on the front foot and advocate. We needed a holistic approach, and that there would be no universal panacea, but there needed to be horses for courses, a different approach, for instance, for buildings that are used regularly and publicly compared to structures which are used for domestic housing. I won't go through all of those recommendations, and I apologise for the smallness of the type, but they will be available in the material that's presented to you. We synthesised it down to an even dozen recommendations. That there should be a national strategic plan, that the focus of it should be around those areas, that we should be aiming for prioritised removal. We said it is reasonable to expect in the non-domestic sector that we should be planning now for all non-residential structures in Australia, places of employment, schools, public buildings and the like, to be asbestos free by the year 2030, and for the owners and controllers of those buildings to get on with it and start to make the planning and budgetary decisions they needed to now. For the domestic housing sector, we said a different approach was needed because of the complexity of it, and that needed to have an inspection regime and a prioritised removal over time regime. I've been given the wind up, so let me just close on this point. The report has been delivered to the government. I'm delighted to say in what is a fraught area, it seems to have bipartisan political support from all major political parties in Australia and from all parties in industry and all of the support groups. The transparency which is in front of you says that the Australian government have accepted the recommendations in principle, which they have, and are working on an implementation strategy. Well, I can advise you that 2 days ago, the Minister concerned introduced a bill into the Australian Parliament to give effect to the recommendations of the Asbestos Management Review to for the first time, we believe, anywhere in the world, establish a national agency which will be charged with the responsibility of implementing a strategic plan, and that agency, incidentally and significantly, is to be called the Australian Asbestos Awareness and Eradication Agency. So I hope that's a positive note to conclude on, and I'd be happy to respond to any questions in my panel.